Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. The State of the Union address is still scheduled to take place next week, but it's not clear where it will be delivered. The Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, has said the president is not welcome in the House. Latest on that just ahead. But first, there was a brief moment, a small window at the beginning of this week when it seemed possible that our media establishment might look inward and learn something useful about itself. Humiliation, as always, is the best teacher, and they were definitely humiliated. In the space of just a few days, two separate high-profile news stories turned out to be utterly fraudulent. First, BuzzFeed announced that former Trump lawyer Michael Cohen had been coached to commit perjury by the President of the United States. The cable news caucus immediately erupted in glee. Finally, we got him! Until Robert Mueller's office weighed in to point out that the story, thrilling as it sounded, wasn't strictly speaking true. So that was embarrassing. And then, just 24 hours later, our entire ruling class united as one to crush a group of Catholic schoolboys from Kentucky who had apparently behaved disrespectfully toward an American Indian man here in Washington. A short video clip on social media appeared to tell that story. The only problem was there were other, much longer videos of the very same event, and they revealed a very different truth. The students from Covington Catholic did not harass anyone. In fact, they were the ones being harassed. Ouch. Various media luminaries swiftly deleted their scolding tweets. Some even apologized for them for getting it wrong. Self-awareness made a rare appearance in the National Press Corps. But the moment passed quickly. It is always painful to concede your mistakes, especially the mistakes you make because you've allowed mindless stereotypes rather than facts to shape your understanding of the world. Nobody wants to admit that. It's much easier to blame others. And so the media did just that. Yesterday, the Washington Post ran a story that summed up the new consensus on the Covington students. Here it is. Quote, a viral story spread. The mainstream media rushed to keep up. The Trump internet pounced. Got it? The real villains here are not the journalists who pushed for innocent kids to be expelled from school and punched in the face. The real bad guys are the people who were offended by the fake story. They're the ones who, quote, pounced. That's what bad people do in Washington Post headlines. They pounce. So, having absolved themselves of any wrongdoing and recast themselves as the real victims here, the media went back on the offensive against the Covington students. One of those students, a boy called Nick Sandmann, made the mistake of going on NBC this morning. And here's what happened next.
Do you feel from this experience that you owe anybody an apology? Do you see your own fault? We looked at that video and thought about how it felt from the other's perspective. In other words, there were a lot of you, a handful of the others. Do you think they might have felt threatened by a bunch of young men kind of beating their chests? Do you think if you weren't wearing that hat, this might not have happened, or it might have been different? There's something aggressive about standing there, standing your ground.
Yeah, there's something aggressive about standing there. Failing to move is a hostile act. We can't have people standing still in public places. Get a move on, son. That's what NBC is telling us. Just kidding. NBC is actually fine with people standing around, most people anyway. Go ahead and make the case for loitering laws and see what happens. NBC will attack you as a fascist before you finish the sentence. NBC just doesn't think that people like Nick Sandmann should stand in place. It's, quote, aggressive. George Orwell imagined a world like this 70 years ago in 1984. For the disfavored, Orwell wrote, the smallest thing could give you away: a nervous tic, an unconscious look of anxiety, a habit of muttering to yourself. To wear an improper expression on your face was itself a punishable offense. There was even a word for it: face crime. Nick Sandmann committed face crime on Friday. There was just something about his face, something aggressive and sneering. For that crime, some of our superiors don't believe that Nick Sandmann ought to be allowed to speak in public. Let MSNBC's Eddie Gowd explain.
There was this attempt to kind of give a fuller account of the young man. And I think a lot of folks were asking the question, why do we always do this in these sorts of cases when white boys are involved? We give privilege to these white kids. He can sit down with Savannah Guthrie and redeem himself. But then there are all of these other folk who we just presume, who aren't so innocent.
privilege. That's the real problem here. Nick Sandmann has too much privilege. So says the tenured Princeton professor with the cable contract. That professor, by the way, works 9 months a year for a guaranteed salary that puts him in the top 2% of all wage earners in this country. His day job has so few demands that he can spend most of his time sitting around a TV studio wearing makeup. And yet he is still the victim of Nick Sandmann's privilege. The Ivy League professor has far less privilege than Nick Sandmann, who is a Catholic school student from one of the country's poorest states. Way less privilege. Doesn't even compare. That's the case they're making. Let's be honest. This entire conversation isn't really related to what happened outside the Lincoln Memorial last Friday. The people who are angriest at Nick Sandmann and his classmates don't actually care what happened there. They don't even know. They haven't watched the video. They don't plan to. This is not an argument about facts and evidence and truth. It's an argument about identity. The Kentucky students are being attacked for who they are, not for what they did or didn't do. The sooner the rest of us understand that, the sooner we will understand what is at stake here. Everything is at stake here. Most specifically, our ability collectively to live at peace in a multi-ethnic society. There's no longer an overwhelming majority group in this country. It is a diverse country, as we're often told. There's nothing wrong with that, but it takes thoughtful leaders to pull it off. The presumption of equality is a prerequisite for a diverse country. Once people start believing that some groups are inherently inferior to other groups, they have more privilege. They shouldn't be allowed to stand in public. There's something about their faces we don't like. When people start thinking that, the whole project falls apart. People start hating each other, and not hating each other for their opinions. We could fix that. People's views evolve over time. Political divisions can heal, and often do. But fights over identity do not. They are different. Identity does not change. It cannot be moderated or controlled. It's inherent. We're born that way. When we go to war over who we are, it is a permanent battle. It is a disaster that lasts for generations. Identity politics will destroy this country faster than a foreign invasion. You should know that as you listen to them push it relentlessly, as they relentlessly do. Victor Davis Hanson is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, and he joins us tonight. Professor, thank you very much for coming on. So we've really passed the stage where we're debating what these boys did or did not do, or the other participants in the moment did or did not do. This is really a debate over whether some groups are good and others are evil. Is there any resolving a debate like that?
No, I think one side wins and one side loses. I think we're in an age of unreality where there's a big truth, and that's predicated on your race and gender and class. And then there's little things like facts, testimony, actual events, empiricism, and that doesn't matter. And in that divide, unfortunately, these students had nothing going for them. They were white, they were male, they were Catholic, they were at a pro-life demonstration. They had hats on, and Mr. Phillips had everything going for him. It didn't matter where he lied about almost every circumstance that he was involved in. The 8 videos could not be corroborated with what he said in various interviews, but he posed as a diehard hero in Vietnam that had fought for swarmy little Brett Kavanaughs like these kids. And once that narrative took over, that was the truth. And had the kids been of minority ancestry, or had they been at a pro-life, pro-choice, or they had pussy hats on, or they'd been female, then, and had Mr. Phillips been white and a real combat veteran who was, you know, humming a country western song and did the exact same things, then all of these people would have weighed in a different manner, because
that's right.
They wanted to get in on the social media lynch mob because they understood that they could virtue signal, and the preponderance, the heft, the centrifugal force in this era that we live in is with identity politics. So whether it was Mr. Morrissey, the Disney producer, who was actually tweeting that they should be put in a wood chipper and then illustrated what would happen to them, he understood that the Disney corporate world would reward that behavior, and if he had did something else, they wouldn't, and they would excuse that if he was wrong. And
but
even my
can
friends,
I also just,
among the
this is so bewildering because this way of looking at the world allows people to protect what they have. So here you have a tenured guy with a sinecure job at some mediocre university, but a job for life that's very high paying, describing some Catholic school kid from one of the poorest states in the country as having more privilege than he does. I mean, it's prima facie ludicrous, but everyone sort of nods in agreement. That's right, he's privileged. We're not here on TV. Like,
well, they do.
How does that stand?
Because they don't believe in anything. They understand. They put their finger in the air and they see where are the career rewards and where's the downside. And the downside is not there because they want to get ahead early and they want to get mean on their social media. And then they not only feel better about themselves, but then people admire them. And that's where the career rewards are to be found. How does it benefit you, Tucker, to say, I think these kids, we should look at the evidence and give them the benefit of the doubt, just like we should get Mr. Phillips and adjudicate it on evidence? Then you're old-fashioned, you're supporting the old racist, sexist class order, and there's nothing in for it. Most of the money, the universities, the professional sports, entertainment, popular culture, it's all on one side, and people make the necessary adjustments. And so that's what this was all about. It's about a higher truth that's social justice, quality of result rather than of opportunity, and we're not empirical anymore because that's for losers. And that's where the rewards are in society. Even a Congressman Omar understood that. Everybody understood that. And that's why they wanted to get on record as early as they could and as mean as they could that their fides was on question. They're just like the mob in the French Revolution about 1790 during the Jacobin Robespierre phase or ancient Athens. And when you get in these revolutionary cycles of extremism, then yes, today's extremism, putting somebody's head in a wood choppers, yesterday's passé moderation. It's just a spiral. And that's what we're in. And it's going to continue until somebody stands up and says, I'm not going to take this anymore. I'm going to say what I want. Shame on you. And you're going to be fired. You're going to be sued. You're going to be held accountable. But we haven't got to that point yet.
Well, I hope we get there soon. Professor, thank you very much for that.
I do, too. Thank you for having me, Tucker.
After being vilified by the press and members of Congress, the Covington students and their families faced a wave of harassment and threats. Yesterday, the head of the high school had to cancel classes. Do these students have any recourse, any defense when the strongest members of our society try to crush them? Well, this morning on Fox and Friends, lawyer Robert Barnes warned that media outlets could be sued if they don't retract the slander against these students. Watch.
By Friday, everybody needs to retract and correct any false statements they have issued about these kids. That includes any major member of the media, that includes any major celebrity, that includes anybody with a substantial social media platform. If you've said anything false about these kids, they are willing to extend you a 48-hour time period, a period of grace, consistent with their Christian faith, for you to, through confessions, get redemption and retract and correct and apologize. If you do not, the next week you may be a defendant in a lawsuit.
All right. No idea if that guy knows what he's talking about, but our next guest does. Libby Locke is an attorney who represented the UVA dean after she was defamed in the famous Rolling Stone fraternity gang rape story, which turned out to be an utter fabrication. Libby Locke joins us tonight. Libby, thanks very much for coming on. You have deep experience in this. The broader question is, how do the weakest members of our society, high school kids, defend themselves when the strongest people in our society, those with tenured positions in cable shows, defame them?
Sure.
What's their recourse?
Sure. Well, they can bring defamation claims or claims for false light, Tucker. There are a lot of potential defendants here that they could pursue. With all due respect to Mr. Barnes, some of the ideas that I've heard him express are not viable options. You can't bring a class action for defamation, and you certainly can't sue a congresswoman for tweets that she made.
So that's relevant because we have a new Democratic member of Congress who accused these boys in tweets of things that are clearly not supported by the evidence on videotape. So they're lies. They can't sue her?
No, she has absolute immunity under federal statutory law, and this is exactly where these students need to take Donald Trump's invitation, President Trump's invitation, and go to the White House and encourage President Trump to open up the libel laws.
So wait, why would a member of Congress, if I, as a private citizen, attack someone, say something that's I know is untrue, and accuse them of a crime, for example, I could be sued, but a member of Congress can't be? Why?
No, there's something called the Westfall Act. The Westfall Act creates blanket immunity for all federal employees, including members of Congress, for stupid comments, false comments, all sorts of different claims that you could bring against a member of Congress, an employee or another normal citizen, are exempted for federal employees. And there are some claims that federal employees can be brought against them, but defamation is not one of them at this time. And this is where Donald Trump, President Trump, should really fulfill his campaign promise to open up the libel laws here. This is one of the areas where federal law prevents Mr. Sandman and his family from getting recourse against this Democrat member of Congress.
So if an employee of a news organization writes something that is provably untrue and damaging to someone much weaker than he is, and that happened a lot over the weekend, that person's news organization is not responsible for it, right?
Well, they can be. They absolutely can be. Here, Mr. Sandman is a private figure. He's not a public figure. You're not going to have the New York Times or Sullivan actual malice standard. That higher burden that would apply is not going to apply to him as a private figure. So liability here is on a negligence standard. That's a much lower standard. And the media outlets who published this stuff and didn't reach out to him for comment, I think they have real legal risk here, Tucker.
Would you recommend to the families of these boys, whose lives I think it's fair to say will be overshadowed by this,
yes,
deeply, and it's deeply unfair, would you recommend that they pursue a legal course?
Absolutely. They should hire experienced defamation counsel, someone, not just an experienced lawyer, but someone who knows this area of the law and who can really evaluate legal claims. It's what we did in the UVA case, where we were looking at federal versus state court, which jurisdiction. Because, look, this is an area where you don't want to swing and miss, because if you lose even on a procedural issue, it's going to be reported as a vindication of the truth of the defamation.
Libby Locke, one of the most successful lawyers in this small but important field. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.